And previously as curator of archaeology, where you're going tomorrow at his Eco South African Museum. And I'll show you some images from there to encourage you to visit a bit more of the museum before you go to the timber store. So there are many thanks for all the people who worked hard to get us all here. So thank you to those all. Thank you to the funders that funded some of the research I was doing. Some of them weren't aware exactly of what they were funding at the time or subsequently, but that's all right. And so what I'd like to do today is I've reordered the first part of my talk slightly in light of some of the things that were said yesterday, to talk a little bit about knowledge production and particularly knowledge location. After that, I'll get on to an actual bit of archaeology. My background is as an archaeologist and as a rock art specialist. I'm not an archaeoastronomist, a cultural astronomer. I just accidentally happened across some rock painting sites, some sand or Bushman rock painting sites that seem to have astronomical import. And I'd like to talk about them, about how what we've been calling indigenous knowledge and Western science, probably somewhat incorrectly, how these come together in a tense but productive way to explain a little bit about what those images might mean. And then finally to talk about pseudoscience in Southern Africa, particularly in archaeoastronomy. It's another knowledge system. I don't think it's a valid knowledge system, but it's one that we have to deal with all the time. I've worked in universities and in museums, and so constantly we have to deal with these things. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. And this goes right through from individual researchers through to sort of state-level hegemonies, if you like. So another way of putting it, the roadmap of the talk would go like that a little bit. I'm a great fan of getting lost. Walter Benjamin, in his essays on a Berlin childhood, wrote about maps. And he wrote about how using a map to find your way was a fairly unskilled process. But using a map to get lost, this took real skill, and it could lead to new knowledge, for example. So in the light of what was said yesterday, I should go back one slide. UWA's logo is in there because we have been instructed by the university in all talks to make sure that the corporate image is well represented. I'm sure those of you based at universities are familiar with this sort of thing. But in light of what was said yesterday about the tension between, again, what we've been calling Western science and indigenous knowledge, the question about funding came up and how you're not going to get funding unless you sort of already know the answer and the timeline and all of those different things. So the systemic violence between indigenous knowledge and Western science is, there is that to a degree. But increasingly we have to watch out for these audit cultures, which are deeply anti-intellectual cultures, and sort of telling us what to do. They have consequences such as favoring established researchers who are vested in certain modes of power and knowledge at the expense of younger, less experienced researchers with a less good track record, but who potentially have more dynamic knowledge to have. So in terms of what was said yesterday, I think in terms of situational ethics, it's perfectly acceptable to defraud your funders in terms of what they expect you to do and what you actually do, although that might be a contentious point. But I stand by it. I'm quite happy to have that on film, yes. We need to educate these funders that we are the thing that keeps them in business, not the other way around. So the first part about knowledge production is mentioned about provincializing Europe and those sorts of things. I agree with that. I prefer to call it locating sources of knowledge production. So what you have here is obviously a map of the world, or two maps of the world. I like maps a great deal because their politics are so clearly inscribed on them as often to appear completely invisible. So what you have in the outline map, the black outline map, is the very familiar Mercator projection. Being science-based folks, obviously if you're representing a sphere flat, you can have shape or size, but you can't have both. So for navigators, the Mercator projection is obviously quite useful and has been for the last almost 500 years or so, because it prevents you from sailing into bits of the world that shouldn't be there. But then in green is what's sometimes called the Peters projection or Gall's-Peters projection. It's an area-accurate map and sometimes called a social justice map. So the shapes aren't correct, but the relative sizes are correct. And so quite nicely, it provincializes Europe. Europe and North America become these much smaller entities. And for our purposes, look how nice and big and central Africa becomes in this sort of projection. It's obviously not that one or the other projection is correct. It's about showing different ways of knowing. So similarly, when we talk about science, we're not talking about science with a capital S. We're talking about a very particular historical, social, intellectual, philosophical, etc. Set of intersections about explain how we come to understand the world, for example. So to make this point in a slightly different way, Blombos Cave, some of you will know about as a wonderful archaeological site which has this very good preservation of artifacts that we consider to be diagnostic of cognitive or mental modernity for our species. And this material is mostly stored at Iziko, at South African Museum. Under South African law, heritage objects are usually things that are over 60 years, they're on the threshold, but heritage objects are the category of the state, which is not an unproblematic claim, which I'll get to at the end of the presentation. So that when anyone excavates them, an archaeologist or whoever, they get a permit, and one of those permit conditions is once the study is finished, those objects go into a repository, typically a museum, and are held there for the state as one of the state organs. So in this site, not a very large site, what you see then, imagine the site about 80,000 years ago where you wouldn't have seen the sea in the background, you would have seen land, or an inland site, for example. So it has a long, long history going back well over 100,000 years. And a number of things have been found in it. One is the famous Blombos ochre, a piece of marked ochre dated to roughly 77,000 years ago, one of our first indications of what we might call symbolic behavior. You can see a replica of it in the museum tomorrow. When you go in, instead of turning right to go to Temberstorp, do that obviously, just arrive a little bit earlier and turn left, and you'll see a great deal of science and indigenous knowledge. Also, if you're interested in that Bertram House, which is just at the back of South African Museum, has an exhibition on Kham San knowledge, about arrow production, things like that, that could just be termed, well, I'll get on to the point. What you have over here, Karen van Niekerk excavated these Perlemoen or abalone shells in 100,000-year-old layers. And you can see this reddish tinge that they have. It's ochre. And to cut a long story short, 3 years of study, this is the Blombos team based in Bergen and University of Witwatersrand. These were containers in which ochre was mixed. And a lot of people go, well, okay, mixing ochre, a bit of water, a bit of ochre. But these are in layers that are 100,000 years old. So this is the first time we know people are taking different substances, putting them together to produce other things, what you might call chemistry, for example. I don't think that you need to call it indigenous chemistry. Call it chemistry. It's at this stage, roughly 100,000 years ago, that we seem to be recognizing ourselves as cognitively modern humans. And so there's another picture of it. This is on display at the museum. And these are some of the various other finds, not just from Blombos Cave, but from other sites throughout Africa. So this is this well-known story about Africa as the home of humanity ×2, one at our species level, and then also in terms of cognitive modernity. So when you hear things, I always get irritated when you hear things like the third world, Africa being part of the third world. When the third world was just near as non-aligned movement that had nothing to do with the Cold War, but it has come to mean sort of dependence and Malays and these sorts of things. But looked at from an archaeological perspective, and to be slightly provocative, we say, well, our species began here. So in a very real sense, Africa is the first world. And then when we went out of Africa, we went to the second and other subsequent worlds. It's a little naughty, but it sort of makes the point, maybe. So in other words, the knowledge, post-Enlightenment science is just that. It's post-Enlightenment science from a particular place. There are parts of it that are useful. But when you look at this stuff and what we were talking about yesterday, the question to me that arises is, how do we move from human knowledge of the three-part sand arrow is so designed so that it will break on impact into the animal, so that the poison that has been mixed from a variety of sources will go in and the arrow can't go out. So that is, by anyone's terms, design, chemistry, engineering, for example. We don't have to use this word indigenous necessarily. So how do we move from that point of a fund of human knowledge amongst a great diversity of different hunting and gathering groups to today, where we are very concerned about indigenous knowledge, Western knowledge, and so on? Of course, you could say, well, there are things like the so-called voyages of discovery, what's euphemistically called European colonialism, or more accurately invasion in various parts of the world. So technology, the development of the microscope and the telescope, for example, people don't often consider the instrumentation, advances in that, and how that helps us see the world anew. So these are a combination of good and bad things. But it seems to me that the sort of polemic between IKS and other knowledge and Western science, if you like, of course Western science has many non-Western elements in it and continues to have, in Western science today and Western science 100 years ago almost bear very little resemblance to each other. But that's set up as a binary, and binaries are very seldom interesting because of the limited number of relationships they allow with each other. If you were allowed a third element to that, or plus x, exponentially you increase the number of relationships. So to my mind, it's less about the relationship now between so-called Western science and so-called IKS, as to where are we going to go with this. I've worked across Northern Australia and in Southern Africa amongst traditional and indigenous communities, and there are many things in those communities I've come to admire, and there are other things that I don't admire, such as, for example, societies which have repressive gerontocracies, a bunch of old men who refuse to change. IKS is often characterized as being traditional and unchanging and stable and that, but no knowledge system is that. Tradition, in people like Terence Ranger and Eric Hobsbawm have argued, is not static or traditional. It's everything. It's that huge fund of knowledge and practices and such like that you have, that you're constantly assembling and reassembling in different ways in order to manage change, for example. Anyway, so that's a sort of ranting overview, if you like. To continue this is that this is a map of global inequality. So the Gini coefficient, after the Italian sociologist and statistician so named, the picture is not good. So here in South Africa, you can see things are very unequal. The relation, the spread of wealth, if you like. And it's no good saying, well, I'm a scientist, I'm in a university ivory tower, and so on. And that doesn't have all that much to do with me. I need to be objective. I need to construct the facts in a consistent way. I need to come up with conclusions that are consistent with those. But that really seems to be a willful ignorance. It seems to be that part of our science should be some kind of activist or communicative role with the public. And obviously this is speaking to the converted here, but sometimes the graphics help with that. So that the problems of today very much are the problems of science today too, I think. So what I like about finally getting onto archaeology, something I actually know something about, is what it helps us to do, archaeology and anthropology, is Johannes Fabian, the anthropologist, talks about anthropology as an out-of-body experience, meaning that by studying other cultures, groups of people, knowledge systems and things, you are able, partially, to step outside of your normal frame of reference and understand not just other people, but also yourself. So, for example, Peter Pels argues that the voyages of discovery were very much less about Europe, in inverted commas, discovering the rest of the world, than Europe, in fact, discovering itself by coming up against the mirror of the other. Often you don't think about who you are until you meet other people, for example, and think about how you behave. So this out-of-body experience is also useful in that you can look back at long-held assumptions and things like that you have. And in my field, I do rock art. So the name rock art immediately stresses a sort of visual element, perhaps, or you're predisposed to think so. But is it in fact so? That ignores the whole production of rock art, getting different things together. We have a series of what are called gong rocks associated with rock engravings that were there, produced sound in association with the images. There's evidence that images were touched and rubbed, rock dust was ingested and painted on your body. It's a real multi-sensorial set of practices and activities. But even if we stick with the visual, do you know how to see is the question. So for example, how many legs does the elephant have? a case of beer if you get it right? Answer would be more than 3, I suppose. You see the face? Yes? You see the word? I don't have a pointer. No. So images and words will very often lie to you, and you have to be able to see through them. A lot of archaeology is a set of surveillance techniques that often come from military backgrounds. This is not to feel guilty about these things, but to locate them, to see what it is they're able to do, what it is they are not able to do. The GPS everyone uses so much today is a military technology designed to locate your enemies and kill them. Onto more pleasant things. Southern Africa is full of rock art. We don't know how many sites there are. About 15,000 have been recorded. And an educated guess that might be about half of what's there. So they're rock engravings, or sometimes called petroglyphs. This is a project in the Karoo in which the engraving in the front there that's being traced is probably an engraving of Pelarogus onticus, the extinct giant buffalo, which probably became extinct about 15,000 years ago. So this is a wonderful record we have. But with it, we have Lawrence Rathenham. He's the head of the local little Karoo school at Restvale. And with him are a bunch of street children from the nearby town of Beaufort West that were farmed off to the school because they were seen as a social problem by the town fathers. They were begging and bothering, in inverted commas, tourists. But what happened is we did a project with them on these various rock engravings, and they now accredited guides for rock art and actually also plant knowledge. They have a great deal when walking. It was amazing walking and looking for these rock engravings. They'd also start spotting plants. I could see the rock engravings because my eye was clicked into that, but I couldn't really see the plants because I don't know much about plants except some hallucinogenic ones. So these guys sort of going, there's this plant, there's this plant. My grandma says you use it for this, says you use that for that. So it's a hopeful moment in the sense of, often you say, well, the younger generation, the knowledge from the older generation isn't transferring and it's dying out. That is true in a lot of cases, but it's not universally the case. Landscapes like this in the central interior, this is very close to where the SKA will come up, and that landscape of the SKA is where the Kham and other San live, in which we have this very rich ethnography, and I'll get onto that, in which star law is and all sorts of things about the heavens are all over the show. But in this engraving country, a lot of people have just come with what we call a gaze and guess approach. You think that vision is just a neutral thing. You perceive the world as it is. You see things out there in an unproblematic way. So this is looking down on an engraved rock there that's about that big. And if I were to ask you what words would you use to describe each of these shapes, it's unlikely that we'd all come up with the same words. And a lot of people have said, these are sunbursts, that's the sun. But of course, it might be. But at that level, that is simply a form that to you, in your cultural conditioning of how you see, looks sun-like. Other people say it looks like a flower, for example. And people then go on to say, well, the engravings have lots of things of the heavens in them. This one, for example, has been said to be a comet, the head over there and the tail going over there. There are potentially a few problems with this. This is on a smooth pavement, is you don't know which way is up. So you don't know whether you're meant to be viewing it as I've shown you here, or in any one of a number of other directions. So you need something necessary and sufficient to tell us that, for example, is a comet. It's also suggesting that the rock artists were rendering in 2 dimensions what they saw in 3 dimensions out there, sort of like a photograph, not looking at any of the cultural conventions that are there. So when you look at the rock painting country, which is a different looking country, it's well known for sort of very beautiful rock paintings. We have other traditions. These are San or Bushman or hunter-gatherer rock paintings. This is Chivenda, African farmers' rock paintings related to both initiation, and this is shown with permission, and political resistance, for example. And this tradition here, this finger-painted tradition of these different forms, that was once argued to represent what in San art, what you do have, in toptic phenomena, a lot of San art relates to altered states of consciousness, in which all sorts of strange things happen to your body. You feel out-of-body experience, you feel as though you've got extra arms, geometric shapes come to describe or represent the feelings that you have. So initially these geometrics in the engravings are thought to relate to this art. But then some research we've been doing, this is just very basic work, statistically these shapes, they don't overlap and they don't graph out. Only correspondences between some of the grid shapes. And those, a lot of people have argued, look either like a text or something from up in the heavens. And it's a complex argument, in that what we think this is we think that this is Kwe rock art, in the old language Kwe or Hottentot rock art. It's a different rock art tradition to San, but we think it relates to initiation and group identity at a number of different levels. And in fact, you can visit a site with this rock art down in Fishhook, not very far away, in fact, Africa's most southerly rock art site, in which the initiation of most Khoi groups does relate to things like the moon, for example. So there might be moons and meanings of moons and stars and such like in here, but the route to them is not directly through visual apprehension of what you're seeing. You need other knowledge, you need that insider knowledge. So moving on to things that might more securely be considered representations of stars, moons, suns, or whatever. We have up in the Waterberg this site, at which there's this enigmatic object over here that some people have suggested might be a comet of bolide, a fireball, something like that. But the gods of archaeology are fairly cruel because there's a big flake over here in the area in which either the handle for a leather bag, if it's representing a leather bag, or some sort of tail might be, but it's not there. We're dealing with a missing piece. The only intriguing thing about it is where it is located. These are human figures around it. Is that it's on a ceiling, and the view shed, when you look at it, the sky is part of what you see. So it's sort of tantalizing, but it's not enough. It's not enough to make any sort of secure interpretation. You need some other knowledge of this particular site. That's my colleague Gabriel Klapi is working there. So that's up there where it says Waterberg. There's another alleged site in the Eastern Cape which is just too unclear to say. But we do have this cluster of 4 sites on the border of the high alpine country, Lesotho, that do seem to depict some sort of astral body. So what you have here, and worked with Tim Cooper here of the Astronomical Society's Comet and Meteor section, was enormously helpful. It's what I like about rock art research. You're constantly working with other specialists. And so you all do it. The point was brought up yesterday about everybody bringing different bits and pieces to the table. The bits and pieces are not equal, but you need them all for the project to work. So what you have, so you've got 2 things, and I'll show you a redrawing of them. You have this painting on the right, which, if you render it like so, Tim reckoned it is possibly a representation of a comet, but question mark. The steep angle, this is again making the assumption that people are painting it roughly as they saw it out there, and that in fact it does represent some sort of astral body. But said this discontinuous tail, the steep angle, the halated heads, those give us some degree of confidence that it might be a comet. And we say, well, there just isn't a lot of this, at least not that we're recognizing in San rock art. Why would they do that? And some of this relates to, that's where you have to go into the ethnography. So this is this unequal partnership. So in trying to explain San rock art, for a long time people did the gaze and guess approach. It looks like an animal, therefore people did it for hunting magic because they were hungry, for example. And it took until the late 1970s when Patricia Winnicum and David Lewis Williams, pictured here, looked at some of these paintings and simply asked the question, what did the people who made this art think of it? A vital but simple question, but that hadn't been asked. And then the next question is, well, how do we find that out? Because the people who made it are no longer here, they no longer paint. Their descendants are here, but not them. And so in the 1860s and 1870s, Lucy Lloyd, the first female PhD in South Africa, and Wilhelm Bleck, a German linguist who was working for Sir George Grey in his library here in Mogo, Cape Town, had some San at their home, over 14 San over a period of 7 years. These were Tom San, and they recorded over almost 13,000 pages, lots of different oral histories, folklores, ethno-knowledge, whatever you want to call it, just knowledge Leek called San rock art and San oral tradition great South African literature. This was in the 1870s. Right? He didn't call it folklore or anything like that, but great literature, because you could see this enormous complexity that was in it. Bear in mind, these San were not there out of their own free will. They were prisoners of the British colonial regime. They had been imprisoned for, in inverted commas, crimes such as stock theft and murder and such like, bearing in mind that none of these Europeans signed any treaties with San for the land, not that they owned, but that they were looking after. So it took remarkable courage, foresight, fortitude for these San, when they were released from prison. Leek asked, could he have some of them stay with him so he could record all of this? He was a linguist who's interested in the language and less in the content of it. And instead of saying, no, thank you, we're going home now, many of them decided, well, this is an important thing to do, basically because they could see the destruction of their society already happening. And it's out of this knowledge that we've come to understand the rock art. So this is just one example, that's the only one I'll show you because time doesn't permit other ones. But this just talks about the belief about what happens when a sorcerer, what's called here, what we might call a medicine person or shaman today, what happens when they die. And the word die, you can't take at face value. Die often means to go into an altered state of consciousness, because to go to the spirit world that's believed to exist beyond the painted and engraved rock face through water pools, you have to die. You come back, it's called a little death, but it's death. So when you look at the picture again, you have a human figure here. It's a person with the legs like so and the arms like so, with a whole lot of flowers, sticks with tails on them, angled around its head. Now, this is a strange posture, but work done in the 50s and 60s in the Kalahari showed that when Hong San dance, and they want more supernatural potency put into their body to activate the Nun, the supernatural potency that allows them to do their spiritual labors, they'll go like this, so that Gawa, the great god, can put more potency here at the base of your spine, which will then travel up your spine, boiling your stomach, and so forth. You'll notice also strange feet that figure has. And those could be interpreted as hooves, because people believed they had to change into certain potent animals in order to do their labors. These are interpretations. I'm not saying, but I couldn't give you that interpretation without that captured knowledge, if you like. I'd never have come up with that explanation. Some other ones, what we're looking at here is the white streak that goes across there at the second site. Looked at like that. Tim sort of looked at it and said, look, there's not a whole lot of detail. The angle is much more shallow, so we might be tempted to call that a fireball, which happens quite often. Why people would have done it in this context, you'll notice the figures again seem to have wings or arms, or feathers rather. So it could be indicating some sort of shamanic flight. You go to the spirit world either by diving through water or by...
In this case we have a depiction of a dance above which there is probably another fireball at a low angle with an elated head and a corona around it. The dance itself is clearly shamanistic, with a number of the features having animal heads. You'll notice figures clapping on the left, people bending and falling down on the lower right, and in the left center upper part, the therianthropes or human-animal transformations that happen at dances. The fact that there's a fireball above these provides this with an extraordinary context. At this next, fourth quite spectacular site, there's a painting of a large serpent, the number of these therianthrope or part human figures walking on or on top of it, and at the top, as a white streak, there is a bifurcated line that has two heads that is very likely representing a bolide, double-headed comet. The heads are painted in red with the white on the outside. It has the characteristic fizz-pop look of a bolide, where the matter within the solid core heats up and splits into two. In San thought serpents lived in lakes, rivers, sometimes clouds and mountains, said to be of enormous size and, importantly, said to be brilliant or shimmering. very much like a comet shooting star would look like. So this is probably not an accidental juxtapositioning. It's putting two very powerful supernatural phenomena together in terms of San or Bushman belief. So what this tells us is that in this localized area, people believed in astral bodies, but this is part of a cultural context. Unfortunately, today we have, since the advent of European colonialism, pseudoscience in which, for example, Great Zimbabwe was for a long time thought not to be built by local Africans, but by all sorts of exotic foreigners traveling here. Of course, today archaeological, linguistic, all sorts of evidence point exactly to the contrary, never mind the oral histories of the descendants of the people who made Great Zimbabwe themselves. But it is important that we counter these pseudoscientific claims, which are particularly rife in archaeoastronomy, literally a lunatic fringe in which wonderful local achievements are denied and absurd exotic hypotheses come into being. And for example, we've had claims that Southern Africa is home to the world's oldest observatory, although there has been no archaeological or geological research done on this. There are claims that the Sphinx, the idea for that comes from Southern Africa many thousands of years ago. Claims, for example, that aliens came down, had sex with humans and boosted our evolutionary trajectory. While in an academic context these might seem ludicrous, they have quite a strong purchase among the general public, and so we need to figure out how we're going to counter these. There are various options. I tend to favor the one on the left, but the better part of me says, well, particularly in African traditions, you have to let people decide for themselves after you have told the story, so to speak, after you have assembled your facts, and then let people speak and think and come to their own conclusions. But the stakes are high. This is not something we can avoid. This is part of academic practice in the post-colony, and it's something that we need to learn the skills to deploy regularly and in good faith. And on that note, I'll end. Thank you very much for your attention.